to the official podcast at contentchampion.com. Join our heroic quest to discover truly epic content marketing. Introducing your host, the content champion himself, Loz James.
Hi folks, welcome to episode 31 of the Content Champion podcast. Thanks for listening. On the show this time, I'm talking with digital and communication strategist Steve Seager. Steve is a master at using hard data to align business strategy, digital strategy and story, and has worked with a host of global brands. Steve is an advocate of the storylining process, the strategic backbone of storytelling that most brands overlook. He says a lot of businesses would see greater results from their content marketing if they just built storylining into their processes from the outset. We had a fascinating conversation, so let's dive straight in. Thanks very much for coming on, Steve.
Absolute pleasure.
Now, with over 20 years' experience in digital and communication strategy, you've worked with many big brands and lecture at top global universities. But winding the clock back a bit, you started out as a professional musician. So tell us a bit about your history.
Yeah, I was a musician. This was sort of straight out of school, and my family were half military and half musicians. So it's sort of one direction or the other, and I went for the music. Yeah, I did that until I was 29. When I realised I wasn't going to be a rock and roll superstar, I thought, okay, I better look at alternatives. But I'd already been doing PR and events and communications and the marketing of my own band and stuff. It was a natural switch, and I studied business management information systems. And then through a couple of weird twists of fate, I ended up actually working in Corp Comms for a subsidiary of Saudi Aramco, the world's largest oil company. Just post 9/11, I was tasked to set up their Corp Comms PR department. That was one hell of a ride. And from there, I worked with lots of different businesses, in-house mainly. And about 7 years ago, I've been working freelance.
Okay. The current trend in content marketing and online brand communication is storytelling. But your view is that diving straight into story without a strategy is why a lot of content marketing isn't working. So what's the problem with brands trying to tell stories?
Oh, that's a big question. There's a slew of 2014 studies that really just illustrate that communications really isn't working. Yeah, I've got some stats here. So the BMA Forrester 2014 study says that 85% of marketers are failing to connect their content marketing with any business value. Only 4% of execs are reporting high returns on digital investments. There's an 85% leakage in funnel-based marketing. So all this storytelling is simply not working.
Okay, so as a screenwriter myself, I find your solution to the problems that are inherent in much of brand storytelling to be intriguing. So tell us about storylining. What is it and how can it help in this context?
Well, in essence, storylines are to a plot what storytelling is to dialogue. You know, if you immediately go out and rush towards, just telling a story and focusing on your features and benefits or whatever, the value isn't in your storytelling, it's in the storyline, so the actual messaging. So the word content, for example, is a really weird one to get a grasp of anyway, because content is the actual messaging. In Dutch, they have a great word, the inhoud, which specifically means that. We don't have that in English. But it's basically what you're saying. Storytelling is how you're saying it. And they're both valid, but basically, if you create a storyline first, that means you've got a really strong plot, complete with a credible beginning, middle, and an end that draws people through a very specific journey towards an outcome. So that's the bit that is generally missing. A good deal of the storytelling is focused really on just an awareness level and nothing that actually drives people through a decision-making journey.
Okay, so storylining can make this process easier, and digging down into this, you have a framework that you call the GAME framework to help us understand this and to go through the stages of this process. So can you expand on each of these sections for us?
Yeah, I mean, GAME is actually just a simple, practical framework that helps align your communications better with strategy, whether it's internal comms, content marketing, or even PR. So the G in GAME is basically setting business level goals. So not communication goals, but actual tangible, smart goals. So measurable, tangible business outcomes. So we're not talking about clicks, likes, follows, or any number of nasty engagement terms or anything like that. So hard business level goals. Then within audience, this is really just, this is your classic comm stuff, which is basically segmenting and prioritizing your audience in relation to your business goals. I think one of the biggest mistakes is that we often think that a single hit of a messaging is going to persuade people to take any action. Of course, it's not. People go through a decision-making journey. So you need to define that journey. And the framework I often use, which is where we then move to messaging, is ACCA. So this is an old ad model from the 1960s, but it's basically awareness. So awareness of the problem, comprehension of the solution, commitment towards that solution, so why it will work, and then action, the final stage. And that's where you create your storylines. And then the last step is expression. The E in game is expression. That's your storytelling. And that's where you pull on all your great narrative techniques of conflict and resolution to be able to tell a story that is cognitive, it makes sense, that it's got a great dose of humanity in there, so it's effective, so it touches your heartstrings. And then conative, so it actually drives you saying, hey, here's your call to action, do this next.
So just backing up a bit then, what comes out of what you're saying really is that people are missing that stage completely, the storylining process and everything that goes with it. And they are jumping in blind, if you like, to a storytelling process that then inherently can't work.
That's the sort of irony. The framework and the process of storylining that I propose and advocate is really designed specifically for business communications. But I first encountered storylining working with the BBC. During one stint there, I was working on Horizon documentaries. And basically, people sit down and create a storyline first. So a plot, a really strong plot that is convincing and draws people through that journey. And they map these out and tie them together really strongly. There's not a script writer on the scene at all. There's not a director on the scene or anybody. It's purely the storylining team that sits down and makes sure that this stuff fits within the right format, that it's logical, that it moves in the right direction. And only once that is done, then you call in your storytelling. And that, I think, is probably why the BBC is so bloody good at what it does.
There's some wonderful programmes on the BBC. I did an MA in screenwriting at Edinburgh Napier University, the Screen Academy Scotland. We made a short film. I've scripted, I don't know, probably a dozen short films, and one of them we made. And that process you just described, the sort of storylining technique before we started telling the story, was done in a group first. And it was no coincidence that was the most successful film, and we sold it to HBO Europe. And it was really exciting that it was obvious to us why it worked, because of the exact process you're talking about. The story had something to sit on, that if that structure hadn't have been there, it would have been more lightweight and more flimsy, and none of it would have held together so well.
Exactly. I think that's the key. I mean, I work with a lot of different types of clients. When we first meet, they often think, oh, here's the guy that's going to come in and do it for us. And it's not like that. It is a participative process. One of the ironies that I found in storylining is that if you work with a sales team, well, senior sales team, and by that I mean 50 plus, these people really get it, because they know that it doesn't take one call to convince somebody to buy their product. They understand that there's a journey involved. Then they soften them up, they give them some information, give them something of value, keep leading them down this journey. So salespeople often click much more easily with the concept of storylining than marketers.
Moving on then to look at some examples of perhaps how a rigorous storylining process, as we've described, can help simplify and enhance the brand storytelling process. Could you give us a few examples of that, please? Yeah,
I've got two examples there. The first one is with a B2B audience for a global ERP provider. I mean, content marketing is a massive buzz of, yes, tell stories, make it personal, do this, do that, and the other. And they were basically doing that. And they were talking about and telling stories about the business improvements that their systems can make. But they basically took their overall value proposition and started to create stories using real people to show how easy the product is to use. Here's the benefits, da 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 da. So even though their storytelling was good, sales weren't actually happening. So when we storylined, we looked at things from the audience's point of view. We found out that, in particular, this smaller business audience weren't looking for some sort of overall business performance. They were really focused on very, very specific issues at each stage of their growth. And that meant that when they were just with 2, 3, 4 people in their business and they're trying to scale, most businesses were just worried about sales. And then a little bit later, when they had 5, 6, and maybe they got a sales department, now they were worried about logistics. So we created a storyline based around the actual journey of the specific issues towards success. And we only focused with the product on the most important features that would help them tackle those issues at any one time. So once the brand started publishing on these, let's say, micro stories, rather than the ones built upon global features and benefits, they really started to get uptake from their presentations. Their blog really started to take off, and it's still going strong today. So the storytelling technique was the same, but the actual messaging and the storylining was the thing that changed.
And another example?
Yeah, especially when you're dealing with particularly complex subject matters and many different stakeholders, storylining can really help. So I have a client who's a global NGO in sustainability, very complex subject matter. So there's environmental issues, social issues, economic issues. It's pretty heavy stuff. And their stakeholders, they were targeting B2C, B2B, government, all sorts of people. Now, the problem is the HQ, the international comms team, are sat here in Holland, and they call up somebody in South America or Asia somewhere and say, hey, give us some stories from the field. And their response, yeah, we've got millions of stories to tell. Which ones do we need to tell? And there was a sort of constant backwards and forwards with HQ never getting the stories they need, people in the field never quite being sure what stories they needed to gather. So we sat down and using the game process, we storylined this. We focused down on each individual audience's specific needs, the consumers, the influencers, and the brands. And then by mapping these, creating a strong plot, we then had a central storyline that we could then split off and ask very specific people in the field for very specific stories that would help illustrate the point we needed to make with our audience.
Those are fascinating examples, but what occurs to me listening to them is that I guess for a lot of companies that aren't doing this, there needs to be some kind of cultural change within that organisation to enable this to happen. And I know you've talked about on your blog, storylining should become a core part of leadership competency, as you say. But perhaps managers part of the problem then in this context. They aren't willing to be more broad-minded and more flexible and open to these types of techniques and just want to plough ahead with the stuff that's maybe, I guess, easier to do, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, there's a couple of things there. I mean, easier to do. Yeah, that's right. And that's the main reason why people don't do it. Because, yeah, it's easy to turn around a piece of content in 5 minutes flat. But if you refer back to the stats that we said earlier, content marketing simply isn't working. It's not anybody else that's saying it. It's content marketers saying 85% of content marketers saying their content isn't working. But what sort of amazes me on that level is that, is finance easy? Is management easy? Why should marketing not be as rigorous as any other discipline? Plus, of course, there's the fact that we're really locked in this short-term campaign thinking. There's the classic pressure to send out stuff, get things done. So, it can be hard to actually get the space to do your job well. But if you do learn the storylining technique, and if you do start applying it, your storytelling becomes much quicker, much easier. You can experiment with all forms of storytelling. You can start crossing genres. You can use comics. You can do transmedia storytelling. It gives you a really solid foundation for all of that.
You're listening to the Content Champion Podcast, showcasing the best content marketing strategies across the web.
We're back with Steve Seager. I get emails all the time and I've had conversations on social media, people saying, look, I understand what you're trying to tell me about content marketing and, all the various stages of the process, but in my niche, it's never going to work. For my size of business, it's not going to work. In the context of storylining and what we're talking about there, are we really saying that it doesn't matter what industry you're working in, you're operating in, and it doesn't really matter how big a company is, if you do the storylining process properly, you should have a very, very clear set of outcomes in terms of what your target audience are actually looking for, and then you can, as you say, base your content on that. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to get down really to the essence of this, it's about your actual messaging. You can do this. You can storyline a single story in 15 minutes flat. So if you're trying to sell something, what you need to do is rather avoid the features benefits sort of trap and think really from the audience point of view, what is it they want? Just get that one single message right, and then you can tell loads of stories just around that one.
And what do we say to the types of business owners that are just looking at content marketing in terms of, okay, leads generated and income earned? Because often, as we know, and looking at perhaps the question of metrics and what we measure and what we choose to see as, if you like, a measure of success in terms of meeting those metrics, a lot of people will say, well, look, I don't think this is working unless I'm generating X amount more leads and X amount of more revenue that can be attributed to the storytelling process that we're involved in. So what do we say to those people?
They're right. If you're basically not getting the business results, then it's game over. These, again, are other stats. 85% of content marketers say they can't connect their storytelling with actual business value. So it's really as simple as that. It's a business argument. If you're in the creative industries, it's a different thing. Then engagement counts, then sharing counts. But really, for business, what counts at the end of the day is the results, right?
Because this is a bit of an elephant in the room with this whole topic, really. What we're basically saying is that in some industries, then, this is problematic and it may not work as well as in others. So we're talking about the whole process of perhaps using content as part of an inbound strategy, and you can storyline and storytell as much as you like, but there might not be that level of engagement that you want ultimately because of the sector you're in. Is that what we're saying?
If you think about any brand, now this is totally guess, I have no stats to prove this, but it makes sense to me that a case study from a FMCG that goes out there is shared more by marketers and communicators than it is by consumers. So in other words, we're victims of our own success because we're all tweeting and sharing, 10 ways to do this, 5 ways to do that. Here's a great case study from there. If you take away all that noise, you've just got to look at what are the business results. And that, if you're a CEO, if you're a CFO, and it should be if you're a CMO, that's where you need to measure.
Perhaps as well looking at the way we promote content on the back end of it once it's been produced and we've been through the storytelling process. Social media, I think, is maybe guilty as charged in some of this, because I have examples of posts I've done that have had a couple of thousand social shares and not really delivered on the metrics that I was hoping they would. So in that sense, sometimes the peripherals, the promotion strategies that are used for content are maybe somewhat by the by, maybe a bit irrelevant to what you're actually hoping to achieve. And I particularly mean social media.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I wrote a post about storylining. You're now doing a podcast about me. So I'm reaching more people. In terms of business results, has anybody picked up the phone and said, hey, here's some work? Well, no, not yet. So maybe we're in the decision-making journey here. But yeah, the whole promotional aspect, social is to blame for over-exaggerating that. Yeah, again, it's just got to be the results that count, right?
Okay, so I know this is putting you on the spot a little bit, but we've talked about different sizes of business. You've given some examples of larger brands, perhaps. If we turn our attention to small and medium-sized businesses, which a lot of the people listening to this podcast will either be working in or owning or managing, how can we use storylining to inform our storytelling with perhaps those key metrics in mind?
I work with a lot of small businesses. And I think that the core thing there, the big insight with smaller brands, even startups, is to really think from your audience point of view. So really understand what it is they are looking for, what they need, how can you help them fulfill a need that they already have?
Okay, well, let's just broaden this out before we go on to the PS question and talk about where we can find your wonderful blog in a moment. With someone of your experience on the call, it's great to ask the question of where you think all this is going. What do you think are some of the trends that are going to come out in content marketing over the next sort of year or two?
That's a difficult question. I mean, if you look at everything from HubSpot to David Meerman Scott, everybody's talking about content marketing in one form or another. And I think the real challenge is in how you cut through the clutter. And that's basically you've got to have a stronger core message, so that's storylining. But then I also think that what we tend to do at the moment in content marketing is we have one central story and then we blast it out and we treat all the different channels we have in social and digital as a bucket for our messaging. And I think this is a massively missed opportunity. What we should be doing is adapting our storytelling form to make it much more transmedia and appropriate to the media that we are in. So infographics is a nice example of like, okay, it's visual. Let's now find a different way of telling our story in some visual graphics. But if we start thinking about the possibilities of video, the possibilities of transmedia storytelling. So Sherlock at the BBC is a great example of that. So using all these different channels you have to actually to use each channel differently. I think that's what's going to be the future of content marketing. So when we get our messages down and then we start focusing on the actual social and behavioral usage of a channel rather than just see it as a bucket for messaging.
Okay, so the answer, I guess, to the overall question, does content marketing work in this context, is yes, but it depends upon various cultural changes, thinking about your customers more than yourselves, and then looking at, as you say, the specific ways that you're going to create and share that content that's related to that storyline that you've created for your customer journey, if you like. And if you don't take the time to do that, you're wasting your time.
Yeah, I think number one is craft. First, craft your storyline. And then second, tell a great story. And I think there's much work to be done on both areas. We can both create stronger messaging by storylining, and we can start exploring really new ways of storytelling.
Okay, that's brilliant. Just before we go on to what I call the PS question, can you remind us where we can find you online, please?
Sure, I'm at steveseager.com, which is my blog, and my little website is on storywise.biz.
Wait for it, listeners. Here comes the PS question.
Could you please share one advanced content marketing strategy that we can use right after this podcast?
No.
Go on, you'll be the only one that hasn't.
Let me have a think a minute.
I'll put some music or I'll put some ticking or maybe some sort of cogs grinding sound in the background. Exactly.
Well, I could take the easy way out and say, yes, it's storylining. My personal pet hate is the 3 ways to do this, 5 ways to do that. I hate it. I think what we're really missing, and maybe this is even a trend in content marketing, give me some long-form content. Give me something with some real depth and some real rigor. So the one advanced content marketing strategy you can use right after this broadcast is actually storylining. So you can download my PDF, you can check it out. I'm going to be posting more on it, and you can start doing it straight away.
Fantastic. Great strategy. Thanks very much for your time, Steve. I wish you all the best of luck in future.
A pleasure. Thank you very much. Cheers, Loz.
You've been listening to the Content Champion Podcast, available at contentchampion.com, Stitcher, Zune, the BlackBerry Network, and on iTunes. Until next time, thanks for listening.